Provost Lynch this morning that when I got off the plane and I came to Santa Croce, I didn't know if I was in Munich. 3 different beer stands, 3 different sausage stands. And the word is kraut, actually, in Italian. At least that's what they used at the thing, so I was shocked at that. Don't let the German name fool you. My mother's name was Maria Antoinetta Imbemba. She came from Bari in Naples, so I do have a connection to Italy in my own personal life. I was a student in Munich in the 1980s when I wrote my dissertation on my first book, which was really on German legal history, the denazification of the legal system. So I don't want you to think I do nothing but beer. The second book was a hobby that I picked up while I was in Munich, and that's the one that you referred to before. But today's talk is really about something I also learned when I was in Munich, which is why all the buildings were different around the university. And it turns out that they were all Italian buildings. And it turns out it was actually Ludwig I that actually built all those buildings because he was obsessed with this place. He was obsessed with Italy, he was obsessed with Florence, and he was obsessed with Rome. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about that today, and I have some pictures at the end I can compare and show you later on. But Ludwig I really transformed the modern city of Munich. Scholars have noted, quote, that we can imagine Nuremberg and Rothenburg, if you've seen those towns, and some of the other medieval Bavarian towns without Ludwig, but not Munich. Munich is the outward and visible form of his dreams and ideals. The first question that arises is why? 3 main reasons can be identified as to why Ludwig wanted to rebuild Munich in an Italian image. First, at the start of his reign in 1825, Munich was still a provincial capital, a small little Gothic city, walled, and which receded into farmland as soon as you got outside of it. Very small, little, tiny place. And Ludwig wanted to establish a capital city worthy of a kingdom. Napoleon had raised Bavaria to a kingdom in 1806. It was still a brand new kingdom. He wanted to build a city to give it some form of prestige. Ludwig intended to expand the capital city of this new kingdom to reflect its importance, to make it a truly royal capital city. Second, as the scholar Josh Hagen has noted, Ludwig also used his extensive building program to solidify his royal authority by attempting to associate his reign with the glories of the classical past. His new buildings, streets, and squares created highly visible expressions of his royal authority. Ludwig, who ruled until 1848, declared that he would remodel Munich in such a way that, quote, no one would be able to say they had seen Germany without first having had seen Munich. We'll talk about whether or not he actually accomplished that toward the end of the paper. And finally, the third reason that Ludwig chose to remodel the city is simply his obsession with everything Italian and Greek. I probably will mention this in the paper, but he took every dime he could from the state to build buildings and museums and artwork, and yet fed his kids stale bread at the palace. He was really miserly in one aspect and just spoiled on the other. So we'll talk about that too. But Ludwig realized that Bavaria was still a small kingdom. It was too small a kingdom to play any serious political role in Europe. Prussia and Austria had to really assume that role. They were the biggest Germanic kingdoms. And so instead, Ludwig turned to the patronage of the arts and architecture to gain political stature and historical grandeur for his kingdom. Ludwig remodeled the city in his image, and that image was Italian. Florence and Rome particularly fascinated the young monarch, even before he became king in 1804, 1805, 1817, 1818, 1823, and 1824, he came to Italy several times just to soak in the architecture and art and buildings. On his second trip to Italy, he brought an architect, Leo van Cleense, that he would work with for the rest of his life, and actually they went around Rome and Florence studying all the buildings and taking notes and extensive notes on the artwork that they wanted to import back to Munich later on. He became very close with the artists in Rome. There was a German colony of artists in Rome. I'm going to mention some of the names: Müller, Reinhard Wagner, and the Danish master who was also at Rome, Bertel Thorvaldsen. These artists, many of them were part of the Nazarene school, greatly impressed Ludwig and Ludwig's construction plans for Munich. So he really soaked in the architect's ideas while he was in Rome. Prior to Ludwig's reign, several travel writers and visitors to Munich had commented on Munich's ordinariness. I'll quote a few of those. Christian Schubart, who was a journalist and composer, wrote that Munich was unremarkable except for a coarseness bordering on crassness. Adrian van Riedel, a famous cartographer, maybe Robert's heard of him, observed in 1796 that Munich was a nice but nondescript town whose palace was plain and barely distinguishable from the homes of the commoners. So it was a really from a European perspective, from a Paris perspective, from a Berlin perspective, a very backwater place. But as soon as he became king, Ludwig set about actually transforming the city. He actually bought the Villa Malta in Rome, and actually then used that as the headquarters for the German artists in Rome that he could converse with. In fact, the Villa Malta became Ludwig's second home in Rome. Ludwig brought his architects to the villa to soak in Italian art and architecture. The architects that transformed Munich in the 19th century now all took up residence with the king in Rome. Von Klenze, Peter Cornelius, Ludwig Schwanthaler, Friedrich Gärtner, and all the guys that would eventually rebuild Munich in the 19th century. One writer noted that as soon as Ludwig became king, quote, new churches were designed, old German Gothic was splashed with friezes, museums sprang up in amazing haste, the broad Ludwigstrasse was laid out, the Odeonsplatz was surrounded by new palaces, workmen were brought from Italy and from Greece. He erected improved versions, that's debatable, of the Arch of Constantine and the Propylaea. The new state library had statues of Aristotle and Homer to guard it. Even before he became king, his father had granted him permission to travel to Rome and Italy, and Ludwig began collecting all manner of artifacts and artworks to bring to Munich as soon as he had the chance. In 1819, Leo von Klenze built the Glyptothek, using the Greek word for sculpture gallery. In the Glyptothek, Ludwig then began to display all the ancient artifacts he collected on every trip that he could. The Glyptothek building in Munich was the first museum ever built in Germany, to give you an idea. And that was 1819. Once he was king, whenever he could, he fled to Italy for rest and inspiration. He visited Italy 52 times while he was king, from 1825 to 1848. And the Villa Malta became his official semi-Roman residence. One of the most important artists at Rome was Johann Martin Wagner, who had taken up residence in the city, had retired there actually. And Wagner became Ludwig's chief artistic advisor and his official agent in the city. He's the one that went around negotiating for all the different artwork that Ludwig wanted to buy and send back to Munich. The most famous one was the Sleeping Faun. I have a picture of it in the presentation. And he had to negotiate with the Pope for that for months. And he really, I think he almost threatened to leave the church if the Pope did not relinquish the sculpture. And they finally were able to purchase it. But I'll show you that when we get to the slides. Under Ludwig, Munich became one of the first European cities to draft a master plan for future expansion. And the model for that expansion was Mediterranean. The new boulevards and districts, designed principally by von Klenze and his associate Friedrich Gärtner, all featured Italian Renaissance-style buildings on the Ludwigstrasse, or Grecian structures on the Briennerstrasse and the Königsplatz. I'll show you those in a few moments. For the new Ludwigstrasse, leading out north from the old city, they used grand Florentine Renaissance and Romanesque-style architecture. At the southern end of the street, they constructed the massive Field Marshal's Hall. In German, it's called the Feldherrnhalle, modeled after the Loggia Delancey, right down the block here. The boulevard then ran north from the old city and terminated with a Siegestor, or Victory Arch, commemorating the Bavarian victory over Napoleon. And the Victory Arch is modeled on the Arch of Constantine in Rome. So the whole boulevard that he built out to the new city is Florentine and Roman. Ludwig then ordered that the entire government quarter, including his royal palace, be rebuilt in classic Mediterranean style. And he ordered that his royal palace be modeled on the Palazzo de' Pitti in Rome. I have pictures of that too. The building erected during his reign, from the new university buildings on the Ludwigstrasse to the impressive museums he built to store as much Italian art as he could, were constructed in Italian or Greek style. If you're standing on the Odeonsplatz, it's almost like being here in the Signoria, Piazza di Signoria. It's uncanny almost. And as a student there, I didn't know that until later on I realized what he had tried to do, and then coming here and seeing it is really impressive. He ordered that the University of Munich, that was in Landshut, I believe, be moved to Munich in 1826. And he ordered those buildings also built in Italian Renaissance style. So since I went to the university there, that's why I realized that something's different here. This is not like town square. However, sometimes the copying didn't go so smoothly. For example, Ludwig commissioned a fresco of the Last Judgment for his new Romanesque style Ludwigskirche, Ludwig's church, near the university. Peter Cornelius, one of Ludwig's oldest and dearest art companions from the Villa Malta days, completed the frescoes in 3 years, and by all accounts, even Ludwig's, it was a disaster. In fact, the king refused to talk to him for the rest of his life. Only after Ludwig was forced to abdicate did they finally have some sort of reconciliation. That's how serious he took his artwork. Ludwig could not build museums fast enough to share the public paintings and antiques that he brought back from Europe, so he built even more museums. The Alte Pinakothek, which Clenza completed in 1836, housed the Wittelsbach collection of paintings. Bavarian electors had been collecting paintings since at least the 16th century, and by the time Ludwig assembled them in one place and showed them to the public, according to one observer, it was the richest collection in Germany. Clenza designed the Alte Pinakothek in Italian Renaissance style. The Alte Pinakothek stands east of the King's Plaza, a plaza Ludwig established on the west end of the Briennerstrasse, which branched out westwards in a 90-degree angle from the Ludwigstrasse, which I'll point out in a few moments. If the new Ludwigstrasse was cast in Italian Renaissance style, the Briennerstrasse and the King's Plaza is in Greek style. The plaza, which the Nazis later paved over and used as a parade ground, terminates at the Great Propylaeon. It's a massive Greek arch-style building modeled after the temple entrance at the Parthenon. Directly across from that, from the Glyptothek, Ludwig commissioned something called the Kunsthalle. It's now called the Antikensammlung, and that's specifically devoted to Greek and Roman artifacts, sculptures, paintings, really sculptures mostly. And Ludwig declared that the architects that built up the Königsplatz would design the three sides of the plaza to represent the three Greek orders of architecture. So if you ever go to Munich and you go to the Königsplatz, the Propylaeon is done in a Doric columns, Doric style. The Glyptothek represented the Ionic style, and the Antikensammlung is the Corinthian. The city continued to expand while Ludwig pushed it further north and west, so his expansion of the city was timely. In 1800, Munich had 36,000 inhabitants. By 1830, the city had 77,000 inhabitants, and by 1840, 95,000 inhabitants. So his expansion of the city outwards coincided at the expansion of the city as well. The Briennerstrasse soon became one of Munich's most illustrious streets. Richard Wagner, the musician, Mark Twain, and Ludwig's ill-fated mistress, the Lola Montez, all lived on the Briennerstrasse. I'll bring that up in a minute. Ludwig also made his son the king of Greece. When Greece got its independence in 1830, he suggested his son for the kingship. And Otto, his son, ruled from 1833 to 1862, until in another revolution, angry Greeks chased out the Wittelsbach emperor and ended the so-called Bavarian absolutism. I thought that was a cute little analogy to what happened over the summer here in Europe. Still, Otto and the various Bavarian ministers that went with him wrote the constitution for modern Greece, and the Greek flag is white and blue, which is also the colors of the Wittelsbach house today. Just because Ludwig imported Greek and Roman buildings doesn't necessarily mean he imported Greek and Roman politics. He wasn't a Democrat by any stretch of the imagination, and the legacy of Greece and Rome is not only architecture, but Republican democracy. Ludwig kept a very close watch on the press and censored all publications to prevent democratic movements, liberal revolts, even the spread of Protestantism, which he viewed just as dangerous to his authority as liberalism and democracy. Ludwig saw himself in the tradition of an enlightened absolutism and resented any interference with his imperial prerogatives. Hagen has concluded that Ludwig's construction program represented a type of aesthetic statism aimed at solidifying his monarchy and checking liberal aspirations. Ludwig's last trip to Italy as king came in 1844. By this time, Ludwig's spending on all of these buildings had become an issue. To finance his building projects, Ludwig cut the salaries of his ministers, reduced spending on needed infrastructure maintenance, defense, education, even law enforcement. Ludwig diverted funds appropriated by the Assembly for the administration of his state for the building program, creating what Hagen has called a royal slush fund to continue his building projects. Ludwig responded to criticism of his spending and his building projects by arguing that, quote, art is not the biscuits for the people. It's not a snack. It's their daily bread, and refused to hear anything more about compromising his building budget. The city even had to impose a tariff on malt. Here comes raising the prices of beer in order to cover Ludwig's building projects. The best quote to talk about how important this was is from the Paris Daily, who said, and I quote, in 1844, Bavarians are nice and sturdy people, but as soon as anyone interferes with their beer, they become wild revolutionaries. And actually, Ludwig had to, because this is also the Hungry 40s, Ludwig had to intervene to put down the price of beer because all hell broke loose in the city once the price of beer went up. If the price of beer went up, it meant one of two things. The king was spending too much or a war was coming. They were planning for war. And he had to interfere in that, get involved in that in 1844. Unfortunately for Ludwig, his other love, aside from Italian buildings, was beautiful women. If you've been to Munich in the Schloss Nymphenburg, he would see a pretty woman and he would just simply have his officers stop her in the street, take her to a gallery and paint her. And he did this once too often with a woman named Lola Montez, who it turns out was really called Eliza Gilbert, an Irish woman who came to Munich and apparently was able to ingratiate herself with Ludwig, and he spent tons of money on her. And eventually he was forced to abdicate because he was taking too much advice off her, and she advised him to close the university during the revolutions, and the students all went crazy as well. He gave it up greatly, but he didn't give up Italy. He returned to Italy one last time after his abdication in 1851, but by then the Romantic era, which had shaped him so much, had all been swept away. His son Maximilian continued some of his father's building projects, bringing as many of them to completion as possible, including the famous Bavaria statue. If you've ever been to the Oktoberfest, it's a big bronze Bavarian woman with a lion next to her, the Bavarian lion, and a wreath in her hair, and she's holding a sword in her other hand, and it's supposed to symbolize Bavarian liberty. And it was a nice bronze statue that you could walk in. It was the biggest one in the world until they put up the Statue of Liberty in 1883 in New York Harbor. When he died, Ludwig's coffin was exposed in the Glyptothek, not in the church. He wanted it in the museum, quote, surrounded by the antique wonders he had collected, whilst the artists of the world and his subjects in their thousands filed by. Ludwig I is remembered today principally for the expansion of the city and its transformation into a world city. After a couple of years, the 1848 stuff was pretty much forgotten. He bequeathed to Munich a classical Mediterranean legacy in art, architecture, sculpture, and style, at least in the new city, which we'll show in a minute. Shannon has written that as a result of the reign of Ludwig I, modern Munich not only became a second Athens, or an Athens on the Isar. Shannon has written that Munich also became the modern Florence. I won't push that point here in Florence, but the question remains, did it work? Heinrich Heine, the famous German poet, insisted that the idea anyone would call Munich the new Athens was crazy. He said ridiculous. One critic called Munich one big classical jumble. Quote, what a heap of anomalies and oddities are to be found in Munich. The new Ludwigstrasse is a choice jumble of styles, Greco-Roman, Byzantine, Gothic, all combined. The library is the Venetian Palace at Rome. The residence is the Palazzo Pitti at Florence. Unquote. French architect Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc wrote, next to the Pitti Palace, a monument of Italian Romanesque, a Byzantine, something like a Roman building, then something Greek, then an imitation of the Vatican Loggia, then a Venetian palace. Viollet-le-Duc argued that all these buildings were ill-suited for Munich's northern climate. And so we can talk about that as well. Even von Klenze, Ludwig's chief architect later on, said that Ludwig went about his building projects in too much haste. Ludwig, he argued, suffered from an inner emptiness, and that he fluttered like a butterfly from one architectural and artistic flower from one to another. Still others lauded Ludwig's efforts and noted the unique charm Ludwig had added to the city. Hans Christian Andersen, visiting the city in the 1850s, commented that, quote, the old part of the city of Munich seems to me like a noble rose bush, which sprouts new branches every spring. However, every branch is a street, every leaf is a palace, a church, or a monument, and everything appears so new and fresh. Heinrich von Treitschke, the famous historian of the 19th century, argued that, quote, Ludwig made Munich one of those great foci of culture that have become essential to German life, and royally fulfilled his promise to bring to pass that no one could know Germany without having seen Munich. Many of the art-loving king's undertakings that seemed strange to contemporaries were justified in after days, when commerce grew and when stately mansions cluttered around these fine buildings. It is clear that Re Mediterranea shaped cities and cultures throughout Europe for centuries. This was especially the case in Germany, especially Bavaria and Munich. There's no question that Munich is influenced by the Greco-Roman culture that he loves so much. But I would have to agree that, walking through the streets of Florence, Munich is not Florence. It's not. It's different. I mean, I knew it was different when I was there, but it's not the same. Ludwig, obsessed with all things classical Greek and Roman, he imposed a Mediterranean character on this new part of the city, at least, despite territorial borders and geographical barriers. Today, Munich possesses a Mediterranean identity which Ludwig imposed as a symbol of classical tradition and political modernity. However one evaluates the final results, Ludwig's efforts demonstrate that Munich clearly stood within the Mediterranean's geographical and cultural reach. It stands there still today. But that's Ludwig I in his royal regalia, and you can kind of see his attitude is very regal, very royal. He's not a Democrat, even though some have suggested that he was a Democrat because he used to walk through the streets without a bodyguard to check on all the building projects. He would show up in civilian clothes and actually tell the architects what they were doing wrong and correct them and things like that. So he was a real strong character. The other thing I didn't put in the paper that I thought about on the 9-hour plane ride here was some people suggested that he might have been a little bit crazy. And the reason I bring that up is that his grandson, if you know anything about Munich, Ludwig II, was in fact crazy and built all those magnificent palaces down in southern Bavaria, Füssen and Neuschwanstein and places like that. You've got to really have something to take all that money that the taxpayers are paying and throw it into building and not care what people are saying. So it's very interesting that the grandson and the grandfather have a similar parallel. But if we advance that, this is the sort of skyline of Munich, if you haven't been there. It's a very medieval skyline, so I figured I'd throw that in. You can see the town hall, the 13th century cathedral, and the various churches there. The old city is very medieval. So as I was thinking about that this morning, the old city is your sort of like Disneyland. That's where the tourists are, and it's all medieval, and they have the clocks and things like that too. The new city is the more serious part, the part we're going to talk about now. And that's why when I first went there, I was kind of intimidated. I went there as a brand new student. My German was anything but perfect. And here I am going to these massive doors and these huge stone buildings that make up the university system. So it was real different. But that's the old city. And then there should be a map. If this is the old city, here's the Hofbräuhaus, by the way, Mark. This is the old city, the old medieval city. So what we've been talking about is roughly from here. This was where the old wall would have been, from here up to, I think there's the Siegestor, that's the Victory Arch. So that's the Ludwigstrasse here, okay? And then the Briennestrasse that he built is here. So the two streets I've been talking about, and the two streets he really transformed, are that part of the city. So the first easiest thing to identify is the famous Feldherrnhalle here in Munich, which is a copy of the Loggia Delancey. This is dedicated to the various generals that played a participation in that were part of the victory over Napoleon. I was there again last night. This is much larger than this, but still, the first time I ever saw a loggia was in Munich when I first saw this. It's a very similar copy. I'm sorry the pictures aren't any clearer than that. Are they any better where you are? Yeah. So that's the loggia that he built. And then next to that, he built a church. This is whoops, oh, damn. I go back? Oh, well, I can use that one too. There's a loggia again. This is the Teatinic here. Can I go backwards? And he modeled that after San Andrea del Valle in Rome. So this one you can at least see that the front is pretty similar, but he took on his own style there too. And this is the piazza, if you want to call it that, or the Platz, as they say in German, in front of the loggia. So it's taken from the loggia here. So it kind of has a similarity to it. And that's a better shot of the whole plaza itself. All money well spent, if one asks me. But next to the loggia, he built a palace. This is, right, well, it's probably the curtain there, but it's modeled after the Ospedale dell'Incente here in Florence. So he ripped down buildings here to do that. That's actually a better example of how he did. Thank you. That's a better. That's the main opera house in Munich, the Staatsoper. There's the Ospedale model there, and this is a Greek Rome building. So you can see what some of the critics were saying, like it's one thing's Roman, the next thing is Greek. So let's try to get moving here so we don't run out of time. But that's the residence that he rebuilt. This is the royal residence here, and it's modeled on the Pitti Palace in Rome. So you can kind of see he was serious. And I mean, that's a distinguished building now. You can't say that looks like the House of the Commoners anymore. So he kind of accomplished what he was set out to do. This is the Ludwigstrasse. That's the main state library, the Staatsbibliothek in Munich. And you can see some of the university, it's all part of the university. You can see the Victory Arch at the end of the Ludwigstrasse Street. And that Byzantine church in the middle that Peter Cornelius messed up. And this is the university buildings. So, wow. Yeah. And I mean, if you walk in the main door here, there's all kinds of stories associated with this that we don't have time to go into, but it's kind of like walking into the Strozzi Palace. It's walking, you open into a big square with columns all over. It's really, and all the lecture rooms are off there too. So, and those are the copies of the Victory Arch at the end of the street and the Arch of Constantine in Rome. Okay. These are the two museums. They're from Library of Congress pictures. They're not really great, but and they're really new. So there's no other buildings around them at the time, but these are the two buildings that he stored most of his art in. This one was really interesting because it was the first done with natural light. They had glass in the ceilings and in the walls so that the art would be illuminated by the natural light from outside rather than artificial light. And these are the Glyptothek and the Antikensammlung. So you can see your different style columns on each one to represent the different Greek orders of architecture. There's your sleeping faun. He had to have that. That drove him crazy. Or the drunken satyr, sometimes it's called, if you know that art. And that's the Propylaeon. That's what ends the Briennerstrasse. It's a huge, massive Greek building. Robert will probably remember because we took a group of 10 students to Munich in March for study abroad too. And that's the lady that brought it all to an end. Lola Montez, I'll end on a laugh at least. Lola Montez was actually Eliza Gilbert, and she had charmed her way through different courts and ultimately ended up in Brooklyn where she's buried. She's buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. She had some life, and that's what brought Ludwig down in 1848. The only king, I think, to be brought down in Germany, at least, in 1848.
My talk is going to be on convivencia, right, which has been a dominant concept in the pre-modern history of Spain. And currently, there's still a lot of debate as if the word still even has any use because it has so many different meanings. And I understand convivencia has another meaning in Italy, right? We'll include that in this too. But it originally was born in a polemic between Americo Castro, right, introducing a new concept in how to understand the emergence of what he called Homo Hispanus, right, the Spaniard. Because his argument, unlike the opposition, would be that until you get to the 12th to the 14th century, the Spaniard doesn't exist. Right? So convivencia today has become sort of a paraphrase for tolerance, right? Which isn't what it originally was for Castro. And I think going back to Castro, we can have a more fruitful way of looking at relationships between Christians, Jews, and Muslims, not just in Spain, but almost everywhere they were in the Mediterranean basin. So first I just thought that I'd like to talk about the word tolerance. It does appear in medieval documents, but not meaning what we mean by tolerance today. Tolerantia, right, back in the time of the Stoics, meant to bear a burden well. Right? And I think there's a lot of meaning, right, in that. And at least for the Stoics, right, it was always in a personal sense, not in a communal sense, right? You bear hunger well. You bear thirst well. I carry a weight well, right? It's very, very different from that. Then medieval canon lawyers, right, because we know lawyers can mess up everything.
No offense.
Okay, they're the ones that began to bring a social dimension to the word tolerantia, right? And it is the community bearing something horrible, right, but doing it with good grace, right? Unfortunately, we all know how European history goes. The term was most often used for Jews and Jewish communities, and also prostitutes for the same way. Something society must bear because the alternative is worse, right? The canon lawyers would say we have tolerantia for prostitutes because it cuts down on rape, right? We have tolerance towards Jews, and then in Iberia towards Muslims, right? Because there are functions that they have, right? For Jews, the function is to punish them for rejecting Christ and to remind us what we were like in a degraded position before Christ. Yeah, it's not a rosy picture, right? This idea of multicultural, we all love each other, this did not exist in the Middle Ages, right? So that's the word tolerantia. When talking about minority communities, and for medieval history, we use the word minority even if they are numerically the majority, right? It's for those without power. So the majority of the population can be Muslim, and we still use the word minority for them, right? Because they're outside of power. For what we'll find is the term that is used most often to describe the treatment of Jewish communities and Muslim communities under Christian rule is utilitas, usefulness, right? And that's part of why the title's so big too. I think there is a difference between pragmatic heterogeneity, right? Many people found it useful to have Jews in their communities or Muslims in their communities, right? It was pragmatic. There's difference there, but the difference is something that we can use. Particularly for kings. Technically speaking, Muslims and Jews were royal property, right? They're outside the tithing system, right? They're outside of everything, and they are my, you know, if I am King James, right, or King Alfonso, it doesn't matter, they are my property. We even have kings in Spain, right, setting up entire Jewish communities, right, as I'm forgetting the term, when you pawn something. Hawk, yeah, hawking a community, right? For example, putting it up as collateral for Genoese bankers. It's like, what do I have collateral? How about the Jews of Valencia, right? And they'll put them up there. So they literally are seen as property. And in any town or city, if a Jew or Muslim was murdered and we didn't know who the culprit is, the entire town or city would have to reimburse the king for the lost value. Right? So this is something very different than what we would consider multiculturalism, right? There were more than one culture, but the idea that yours is as good as mine, right, would seem ridiculous to a Qadi, a rabbi, and a bishop, right, that have all different views on different sorts of things that all agree, right, that the different messages are not equal in that sense. So utilitas is the main thing that makes the heterogeneity pragmatic, right? Also because, for example, once the Reconquista, I don't really like the word Reconquista because it's not the same people conquering the territory back, you know. But as that's happening, if all of a sudden you conquer, right, numerous different regions, and the entire working population is Muslim and is now going to be mudehar, you can't just kick them all off and replace them with Christian immigrants. There's not enough Christian immigrants to do it, right? So it's something that you have to adapt to, right? In that sense, it'd be tolerantia, but it'd also be utilitas, right? These people are useful to me. So I thought before maybe talking about Castro and what he meant by convivencia, because for him it is what we would call cross-cultural cooperation. But for Castro, it was also conflict, right? Convivencia is about the creation of the Spanish identity for him. And that's interesting, I should point out before I get to Castro, is Castro claimed that this only happened in Spain, right? There could be Muslims, Jews, and Christians in Sicily, but no, you know, this process, it only happened in Spain. They could be in what is today Israel and Palestine, but no, the process only happened in Spain. If anything, right, he was a real humanist and a real patriot. And not a historian, he was a philologist, actually by training, who has a big conversion sort of experience to thinking about convivencia when he's 50. And that's why he always told all of his graduate students, you really shouldn't write anything until after you're 50, right? Which isn't the best advice for newly minted scholars, right? I mean, I don't think many tenure committees are going to be like, well, my advisor told me not to publish anything until I'm 50, right? Because he said you'll change your mind. So I think before maybe getting into Castro and how this idea emerges, I just give a couple quick anecdotes about different types of relations between Christians, Jews, and Muslims in the Middle Ages. I'll start with Pope Urban II. I'm sure many of us, right, have heard of Urban II. He's the Pope that summons the Council of Clermont that will result in the launching of the First Crusade, right, to recover Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem was lost 400 years earlier, right? The recovery is a little belated, right? But for a lot of reasons, it's about recovery. And he has the horror stories, right? The spawn of Satan, all that sort of stuff. We got to go and recover it. Most people have heard that in the speech. What many people don't realize is that Muslim troops protected Pope Urban from the German emperor's troops while they were invading. I mean, Urban couldn't even get into Rome. German emperors, right, we know if they didn't like a pope, they got their own, right? And we could have multiple ones. So Pope Urban, right, who unleashes, right, a 700-year movement of crusades, actually was defended by Muslim troops, right, that were put out from the King of Sicily. The second one is Frederick II, right, who's very, very well known for this. Frederick II, first of all, he grew up being able to speak Arabic. He grew up in Palermo, right? He could also speak Greek, right? He fancied himself the intellectual. And he's very, very famous, right, for sponsoring scholarship, right? Something that we'll find with equivalence with Alfonso X, right, in Spain, and various things like that. He would correspond with Muslim rulers in Arabic throughout the Mediterranean, pose them philosophical questions. But he deported the entire Sicilian Muslim population to Lucera, right? Essentially creating one giant, right, ghetto, right? The reason for that, of course, is that while he grew up, there were numerous subject Muslim revolts that were going on. It was a security thing, right? Frederick didn't really have a huge problem with that. And when Frederick did finally go on his crusade to take Jerusalem, he brought Muslim troops with him, right? So the idea of Italian Muslims going on a crusade, right, for someone who's in charge of Germany but grew up in Palermo, right, this is the sort of complexity, right, that we have. And Alfonso X, right, a contemporary, often called Alfonso the Wise. Political historians like to call him Alfonso the Not So Wise. He's planning on the invasion of North Africa, right, almost his entire career, because the Visigoths had it, I have to have it, right? He tries to invade it a couple times, right? It doesn't work out well for him. But when North Africans end up invading Spain, it's to protect Alfonso from his son Sancho, right? So my enemy, right, is now the one who's coming to bail, to bail me out, right, on this. And one final story that I'll add to this. I know it sounds like a joke, right? There's 3 merchants walk into an inn, right? Two of them are Muslim and one of them are Jewish, right? And they tended to like interfaith partnerships because you could hide interest behind the other person, right? Because there were usury laws against everybody, right? But that's why we have Muslim investors in the wine business, right, who like to do it through a Christian front, right, because of the prohibition on alcohol. But so these 3 merchants, they walk into an inn. They've been business associates for a long time until, right, the communal purse is missing, right? So I think, right, the communal purse, right, it's missing, right? No one knows where it is. So the 2 Muslims, even though they've been business partners with this Jew for so long, immediately blame the Jew. And they're ready to drag him before the Qadi for it until we find out, right, the inn owner's pet monkey stole the purse. Right? So it just shows even long-term relations, right, that is based on utilitas, right? They all had a mutual use, right? Sometimes when something unexpected happens, what Nassim Taleb calls a black swan. Spanish history is filled with black swans, right? Unexpected events that completely change everything. When it comes down to it, right, if it's us three, right, and it's missing, it must have been the Jew, right? Or if we reversed it and it was Christians and a Muslim, it must be the Muslim, right? So this is the limits of the actual type of cooperation that we can find, right? And that. As far as Americo Castro goes, Castro himself is kind of the history of convivencia in the making. The Castro family had traced its pure descent, right? We all know that's a big thing. Traced themselves back, they're from Granada, right? And in Granada, I mean, the chances of anyone having pure blood of one sort, right? You could win megabucks every day, right, for a year and have better chances than that. Eventually found out that he was, when you trace back the lineage, right, he was of new Christian stock as well with his descendants, either a Jewish or a Muslim. Either one could have been the case. But Castro was actually born in Brazil. But returns about the age of 3 or the age of 4. He goes to the University of Granada, right? Then he goes to study in Madrid, and he immediately gets chastised for his Granadan accent. You have to stop, you know what I mean? And this is what, if you're a philologist in training, right, getting chastised because your Castilian is not good, right, creates, some sort of problems in that sense. Anyway, the real turning point for Castro, as many people for his age, he was part of the generation of 98, right, after the Spanish-American War when Spain got divested of the colonies. This created a real crisis in the self-consciousness, right, of Spain. How do we go from a great empire, right, to we can't even hold on to Puerto Rico? Right, Cuba's gone. You know what I mean? There's like one island left of the empire, and many Spanish intellectuals started speculating on the inferiority. Right, we are inferior when you look at science, you look at military technology. Right, ever since the Armada, it's been a big slide down. In that. So what is it, right, that did this? Right, why has our growth been stunted? And for many, it was the Muslim menace, right? That while other Europeans were developing science and were developing liberalism, right, and republican forms of government, right, we Spaniards were holding the fort, right, against the Muslim menace, right? So everybody up in Paris thinking grand thoughts can think them safely while we're in the trenches, right, keeping this back. And Americo Castro, he's an expat, right, like many liberal intellectuals, right? The Spanish Civil War, he flees. He never comes back. He actually adopts Brazilian citizenship and not American citizenship and writes all of his best works from exile. But his view, which comes out in 1948, on the idea of convivencia, right? Menendez Pidal, right, his great philologist instructor, first coined the phrase convivencia, but it was convivencia de normas. What he was interested in is how variants of a word coexist in a language so long. They work with each other, right? They struggle with each other for dominance. And then why does one word win in Latin America, right, where that version lost, right, in Spain? So this, right from the philological origins of convivencia, there is the cooperation, there is the integration, but there's also the clash, right? And it's through the creativity and the clash that new identity comes from, right? So he says there never was an eternal Spaniard. The opponents are saying, right, Seneca was a Spaniard, right? And you can trace Spanishness from Seneca to Unamuno, right, in a straight arc, a straight trajectory. And Castro said that's not the case. The reason Spaniards are different, right, is because of the convivencia between what he called the 3 castes, right? Castro, in addition to hating Braudel and the Annales school, he thought they dehumanized everyone. He never wrote this, but among his graduate students, he referred to Braudel as the distinguished liar. right, who does not recognize humanity existing in any of their subjects. It's all geography, it's all quantitative, right? It's all this. He doesn't understand the living, breathing beings behind it, which is what Castro wanted to do. He had a whole concept that emerges from this, the space of the lived life, right? And how three different castes can live in that life at the same time, conflicting and cooperating. A couple examples of convivencia, right, the three greatest that he used. And he's always coming up with neologisms because in addition to hating the Annales School, he hated social theory as well. So, I mean, he wouldn't consult anthropologists, he wouldn't do that. He's kind of just doing it on his own. But to show things that are typically Spanish, right? One of the examples that he take is Santiago, right? And the pilgrimage route to Compostela, right? He points out, right, every place has its patron saint, but Santiago de Compostela, its pilgrimage route, it's something that's very, very different. His view is, right, that what becomes Spaniards is building their identity partly in response to what they're facing. So before someone is Catalan, before they're Aragonese, right, before they're Castilian, they're Christian because that's not what the other side actually is. And he actually believes, you can imagine the response among traditional Spaniards when he did this, particularly Catholics, that Santiago was an imitation of Muhammad, right? And the pilgrimage to Compostela was an imitation of the Hajj, right, to Mecca, because they saw the value, they saw the utility right behind it. What's that?
Castro said that?
Yes, yes, yeah. Actually, there was a guy 50 years earlier that said it in a travel book, right, from Britain. It's the first time, but Castro didn't know about it. But, and I mean, Santiago, I mean, that's as Spanish as tapas. And all of a sudden, if you're finding out, right, it got swiped from Islam. Right, it's sort of, it sort of, blows everything. The Inquisition, right, also very, very Spanish. For him, what the Inquisition is, if you look at it, is once you have enough converted Jews who now become Christian, right? Just because he takes race out of it doesn't mean he doesn't sneak bigotry back in the other way. What the Inquisition was for Castro was one giant rabbinical court, right, remade, right, in these lines. And the reason we have the first insistence of purity of blood and the idea of race in Spain is because it had the most amount of Jewish converts who brought into their Christianity an emphasis on the importance of bloodlines and ancestry, right? So while praising Jewish, contributions, we can see he also begins to expel them. 2 minutes, all right. So I'll wrap it up. Obviously, the paper is much bigger than it is, but I'll get to the so what question, right? Because my argument is that Castro's original idea of convivencia, which is creativity, the generation of new identity, but through conflict, right? Particularly since the 1980s and multiculturalism, there's been a big emphasis, right, on the cooperative, the convivencia. And of course, it depends what you use for sources. If you're using poetry, you'll find a warm, fuzzy place. If you're using art, you'll find an interesting place. If you're looking at documents, you find people's noses getting cut off for having sex outside of their relationships, right? But I'll just leave it on this. Sometimes I get the question, right, from students, so what's the importance of what you do, right? For being a medieval historian, right, to justify my existence, we always came up with things like, well, it's through us that the modern state gets created. So if you want to understand the rise of the modern nation state, we're the ones that provide it. I think now, for understanding something like the Mediterranean basin, it's the fact that much of what we do pre-existed the state. You have pockets of different ethnicities, right? You have pockets of different religions, right? They're much more multidimensional, right, than we tend to think. Even when we're talking about Jews, right, depending where you are they rabbinic, are they Karaite, are they Samaritan, right? When we're talking about Christian, you know what I mean? There's multiple types and each has their own agenda. Point being is cooperation was possible based on utilitas, right? And I think when we're looking at Islam in the West, I hate the phrase, but it's simple, we have to think about what Muslims, who in the West, right? And cooperation in the Middle Ages was possible based on usefulness and shared common, right? Rather than a nice, happy, liberal ideology. Personally, I trust greed more than idealism, right? So if there are mutual ways that we can work for each other's benefit, it manages to create that sense, right? And finally, Castro's vision was, what does Spain contribute? We didn't contribute modern science, we didn't contribute the Industrial Revolution. He said, what we Spaniards contribute, right, is a humanism that manages to go beyond religion, right? And that will be Spain's great contribution later on, right? You know, to prevent us from killing each other, right, is what he says. I mean, he's coming out of the Spanish Civil War, going through World War II. He feels military technology is run amok, right? What Spain is contributing is that pragmatic humanism, right, that really comes out of its 400-year struggle to decide what a Spaniard is, right? And if that can be applied to understanding the Mediterranean or the world today, he would be very, very pleased with that.